Maya remembered the day everything changed, though some nights she wished she could forget. She was only 23 solar cycles old when the Vorthan ships first appeared in the sky above her homeworld of Ethermore. She had been working in the crystal archives that day, cataloging the ancient texts of her people, when the lights began to flicker and dim. The elder scientist had rushed past her, their faces filled with an emotion she had never seen before. Fear. Pure, undeniable fear. She had followed them to the observation tower and watched as the massive shadow passed over their city. The Vorthan mothership was so large that it blocked out the sun for almost 3 minutes. It was not beautiful or elegant like the ships of her people. It was purely functional, a thing of angles and weapons and hungry technology. Even from this distance, Maya could feel the malice radiating from its presence. The first attack came without warning. The energy beams descended like rain, turning the crystal spires of the outer city into dust and memory. Maya watched her childhood home explode in a cascade of blue fire. She saw thousands of her people running through the streets trying to reach the underground shelters. Most of them never made it. The Vorthan did not discriminate between soldiers and civilians, between the young and the old. To them, all life was either fuel or obstacle, and Ethermore was neither. Her father had found her in the tower and pulled her down into the depths of the archives. He was a scientist too, one of the greatest minds their people had ever produced. His name was Aldrin, and he had spent the last 50 years studying the most forbidden knowledge of their civilization. He had studied human technology that had crashed on their world centuries ago, when human explorers were still learning to reach beyond their own system. He had kept these studies secret because the Council of Elders considered it heresy to learn from beings they considered primitive and crude. But on that first day of the invasion, he had brought Maya to the deepest vault beneath the archives. There, hidden behind layers of protection spells and locked doors, were the remnants of human scientific achievement, solar panels that still held their charge after 300 years, data drives containing the sum of human knowledge from their golden age, medical technology that could heal wounds that elf doctors could not even understand, and most importantly, genetic templates and biological engineering tools that no elf had dared to use in living memory. Her father had looked into her eyes and told her something that would define her entire life. He said that the elves had become too comfortable with their perfection, too certain that their ancient wisdom and pure bloodlines made them superior to all other beings. He said that survival was not about being the strongest or the most elegant. Survival was about being willing to change, to adapt, to take risks that your enemies could never imagine. Survival was about using everything available no matter where it came from. Then he had given her the data drives and asked her to run. He stayed behind in the archives to buy her time, to activate the self-destruction sequence that would bury the Vorthan forces attempting to capture the knowledge stored there. She never saw him alive again. For 3 days, Maya ran through the ruins of her civilization. She watched the sky burn. She heard the screams of her people echoing through the valleys where she hid. She saw families torn apart by plasma weapons and automated drones. She watched the Vorthan construct their processing plants, massive factories that would strip the resources from Ethermore until nothing remained but a dead ball of rock and dust. On the 4th day, she reached the settlements in the deep caves where the resistance was forming. There were maybe 5,000 survivors out of the billion elves who had lived on the planet before the invasion. 5,000 out of a billion. The number was so impossible that Maya could not fully comprehend it at first. She kept waiting for herself to wake up from this terrible dream. The resistance leaders were desperate. They had some old weapons from the time before peace, military technology that their people had not needed to use in thousands of years. But these weapons were nothing compared to what the Vorthan possessed. They could slow the enemy, but they could never defeat them. They could make the Vorthan pay a price, but eventually, the sheer mathematical certainty of attrition would wear them down to nothing. It was then that Maya stepped forward and revealed what her father had given her. The data drives were ancient, but the knowledge contained within them was revolutionary. She explained to the Resistance Council that humans, for all their flaws and their limited lifespan, had a gift that elves had never developed. They had the gift of rapid innovation. They could see a problem and invent a solution in a single lifetime. They could build on each other's failures and create something new without worrying about violating tradition or ancient law. The council was skeptical at first. These were elves who had been taught since childhood that human technology was primitive and crude, but they were also desperate. And desperate beings will consider things that they would normally reject. They gave Maya access to the underground laboratories, the secret places where elf scientists had once attempted to push the boundaries of what was possible. Maya spent the next week studying the human genetic data, learning how their bodies had been designed for rapid muscle development and quick healing. She studied their medical technology, understanding the principles that guided their approach to solving biological problems. And then she began to modify herself. Not drastically at first, just small changes. She improved her muscle density to match a human warrior's capability, while retaining her elf grace and speed. She enhanced her metabolism to allow her to process nutrients faster. She rewired her neural pathways to accept technological implants without rejection. Other volunteers came forward, not many, because what Maya was proposing violated every law of their people. It was considered abomination to merge with machine, or to alter the elf form in such radical ways. But these volunteers were like her. They were children of a destroyed world. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, but even this was not enough. Maya realized that biological enhancement alone would not save them. They needed something more. They needed to think like humans would think. They needed to make weapons that were not elegant or beautiful or tied to ancient tradition. They needed to make weapons that simply worked and did not care about aesthetics or philosophy. That was when she discovered the dragon eggs. Deep in the genetic archives, there were templates for creatures that the elves had created in ages past. Dragons. Beings of power and intelligence, designed to be bonded with an elf through a symbiotic neural connection. These creatures had not been seen in thousands of years, but the genetic data was complete and intact. The Resistance gave her one chance to make it work. They provided her with the bioengineering equipment and the nutrients required. They cleared out an entire chamber beneath the mountains and let her work without interference. For 6 weeks, Maya did not sleep. She worked with a determination that bordered on madness, knowing that if she failed, it would only be a matter of time before the Vorthon found their hiding place and destroyed them all. When the first egg began to crack, she was there watching. The creature that emerged was small at first, barely larger than a human child. But even in its newborn state, Maya could feel the intelligence radiating from its golden eyes. She reached out with her mind, feeling for the neural connection that should exist between elf and dragon, and found it immediately. The link was pure and clear and perfect. She felt the dragon's joy at awakening, felt its hunger and its confusion, felt its absolute loyalty to her as its bonded creator. She named the dragon Kira. The second egg hatched 3 days later, and that dragon she named Zephon. And with Kira and Zephon came hope that was almost painful in its intensity. For the first time since the invasion began, Maya allowed herself to believe that her people might survive. They might not win, not against an enemy as vast and powerful as the Vorthon, but they might survive. And survival was the first step toward everything else. The other survivors began to see her differently after the dragons hatched. They had looked at her before with a mixture of fear and desperation, uncertain whether what she was doing was salvation or heresy. But when they saw the dragons, when they felt the connection that bonded Maya to the creatures, they began to understand. This was not abomination. This was the future. This was what their people had to become if they wanted to continue existing at all. The elders still grumbled and spoke of ancient laws and the purity of their bloodline, but even they could not deny that the old ways had failed. The old ways had left them unprepared and vulnerable. The old ways had almost led to their complete extinction. Perhaps, they grudgingly admitted, it was time to consider new paths. Perhaps survival itself was the highest law, and everything else should bend to serve it. Maya stood in the birth chamber looking at her 2 dragons as they grew and learned and bonded with her through their neural connection. She could feel their thoughts now as easily as she could feel her own. She could sense their fear and their strength and their absolute readiness to fight for her, to fight for their people, to fight against the darkness that threatened to consume everything they were. She did not know if this. 3 months after Kira and Zephon hatched, the first major battle took place at the Canyon Fortress. The Vorthon had finally located the main resistance settlement, and they were sending a significant force to wipe it out. The force consisted of 23 automated drones, 3 Walker-class combat units, and 1 command vessel that would provide tactical support from above. It was the largest force they had sent against the resistance since the invasion began, and everyone in the underground settlement knew what it meant. The Vorthan were getting tired of hunting. They wanted to end this, and they were committing serious resources to make sure it happened. Maya had spent the weeks before the battle preparing. She had worked with the resistance engineers to set up weapons positions throughout the canyon. They had fortified the entrances to their tunnels with explosive traps and barricades, made from the strongest materials they could find. But she knew that none of this would matter if the Vorthan were able to breach their defenses and enter the deep chambers where the children and elderly were hiding. The night before the battle, she could not sleep. She stood at the edge of the canyon and looked up at the stars, feeling the presence of Kira and Zephon through their neural link. The dragons were not afraid. They did not understand fear the way humans did. They understood danger and excitement and the joy of a hunt. They did not understand the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that thousands of lives depended on what happened tomorrow. She reached out with her mind and touched Zephon's consciousness. The dragon was resting in a cave high above the canyon, his scales reflecting the starlight in 1,000 different colors. She felt him stir at her touch and felt the immediate rush of his attention and his love. These dragons had been created by her hands and by her will, and they knew nothing but loyalty to her. It was a strange thing to be loved so completely by a creature you had yourself brought into existence. It was also a heavy responsibility. When the Vorthan ships arrived at dawn, the first thing they did was bombard the canyon with sensor drones. These small machines would fly through the air and map out the terrain, identify defensive positions, and mark targets for the larger weapons. It was standard Vorthan procedure, and the resistance had prepared for it. As soon as the drones appeared, the fighters positioned on the canyon walls opened fire with the ancient elf weapons. They managed to destroy 7 drones before the Vorthan returned fire, killing 3 of the fighters and forcing the rest to retreat into the tunnels. Maya watched it all from her position on a high outcropping. She could see everything happening in the canyon below. She could see the smoke and the fire and the chaos of battle. She could feel through her neural link the moment the first automated drones crossed the canyon entrance and began advancing toward the main gate of the settlement. She sent the signal through her implant, and Kira launched from her resting place. The dragon descended like a meteor, her wings barely slowing her fall as she crashed directly into the advancing line of Vorthan drones. The impact was devastating. 3 of the machines were destroyed instantly by the force of the collision alone. Kira's claws tore through metal like paper. Her tail whipped around and smashed another drone into pieces. The remaining machines tried to turn their weapons on the dragon. But by that time, Zephon was already diving from the opposite side of the canyon. The 2 dragons worked together with a perfect synchronization that only creatures bonded through shared consciousness could achieve. They were not soldiers fighting a battle. They were predators hunting in their natural environment. To them, the Vorthan machines were nothing more than prey. The machines were faster in many ways and more heavily armored. But they lacked the flexibility, the adaptability, and the raw physical power of the dragons. Within 4 minutes, every automated drone in the canyon had been destroyed. The Vorthan command vessel began to fire from above, sending plasma bolts down into the canyon in an attempt to destroy the dragons or drive them away. But Maya had anticipated this. She sent another signal through her implant, and the resistance fighters activated the energy shields she had helped them build. These shields were not purely elf technology. They were a hybrid design that used human principles of power distribution, combined with elf understanding of energy manipulation. They had never been tested in real combat before, but they worked. The plasma bolts bounced off the shields and scattered into the sky, harmless. The Walker-class combat units were tougher. These machines were the size of a small building, with multiple weapon systems and armor that could withstand significant punishment. When they reached the canyon floor, they began to systematically destroy the resistance defensive positions. A machine gun position that had been harassing them for minutes was obliterated by a single blast. A barricade of reinforced metal was crushed beneath an armored foot as the walker passed over it. But Maya had not relied entirely on conventional weapons. She had hidden something else in the canyon, something that the resistance had managed to keep secret from all but a handful of people. It was a trap, but not the kind that the Vorthan would be expecting. She had taken the self-destruct technology from the Vorthan drones themselves and modified it using human engineering principles. The modified devices did not just destroy themselves. They created cascading energy reactions that would amplify exponentially through a radius of nearly 300 meters. When the first walker stepped over the trigger line she had marked, the trap activated. The energy release was instantaneous and spectacular. The walker machine was lifted off the ground and torn apart by forces it had no defense against. The second walker tried to retreat, but it was too late. It too crossed the trigger line and met the same fate. The third walker managed to retreat partially, but it was already damaged by the energy release. When Maya sent Kira after it, the dragon made short work of the crippled machine. The Vorthan command vessel attempted to retreat, but it too had not escaped the canyon without damage. A piece of debris from the destroyed walker had punctured its hull, and it was already beginning to lose altitude. It limped away toward the horizon, clearly not planning to return anytime soon. The battle was over. It had lasted less than 20 minutes. The resistance had lost 15 fighters and suffered some damage to their defensive positions, but they had defeated a force that was 10 times their size, and they had done it without being overrun or pushed back into the tunnels. The celebration that followed was muted at first. The survivors gathered in the main chamber and looked at each other in something like shock. They had won. After months of hiding and preparing and watching their people die, they had actually won a battle. It was a small thing in the larger scope of the invasion. The Vorthan had countless more ships and soldiers and machines, but it was proof that they could fight back. It was proof that resistance was possible. Maya stayed apart from the celebration. She walked back to where Kira and Zephon were waiting and spent an hour simply standing with them, her hands on their scales, feeling their contentment through the neural link. They were proud of what they had accomplished. They understood that they had protected the humans and the elves and all the other refugees hiding in this place. They understood that they were hunters and warriors, and that this was what they had been created for. An elder named Theron approached her as the sun was setting. He was one of the few elders who had accepted the changes that Maya had brought to their people. He had been a warrior in ages past, before the elves had chosen the path of peace and comfort. He bowed to her, which was unusual. Elders rarely bowed to anyone. He told her that the council was meeting to discuss their next move. He told her that they believed the Vorthan would send an even larger force the next time they attacked. He told her that the resistance needed to think not just about defending their position, but about going on offense. He told her that if they wanted to survive, they had to be willing to take the fight to the enemy instead of just waiting for the enemy to come to them. Maya listened to him without speaking. She understood what he was suggesting. It meant taking their dragons and flying out into the sky where the Vorthan ships waited. It meant engaging the enemy in open combat instead of in the controlled environment of the canyon. It meant accepting that some of them might not come back from such a mission, but she also understood something else that Theron might not have fully grasped. The Vorthan had invaded her world with the assumption that biological creatures like elves and even modified humans would be unable to mount an effective resistance. They had assumed that they had overwhelming technological superiority and that it would be enough to crush any opposition. They had not encountered beings who could bond with dragons, who could merge technology with ancient magic, who could think like humans and fight like elves and move with the grace of creatures who were neither and both at once. Tomorrow, she would take Kira and Zephon up into the sky and show the Vorthan exactly how wrong they had been. Tomorrow, the resistance would become something more than just survivors hiding in the darkness. They would become hunters. They would become a threat that could not be ignored or dismissed or overcome through sheer force alone. The first time Maya flew beyond the canyon and saw a Vorthan warship up close, she understood why her people had been so afraid. The ships were massive beyond comprehension. The smallest vessel in orbit above Ethermore was the size of a mountain. It hung in the black sky like a predator waiting to strike, its weapons glowing with an ominous red light that suggested they were actively charging. To an elf standing on the ground looking up, such a thing must have appeared to be the work of gods, something so far beyond the scope of what was possible that resistance would seem like the delusion of a madwoman. But Maya was no longer standing on the ground. She was flying on the back of Kira at an altitude of nearly 40,000 meters, moving at speeds that would have been impossible for any biological creature created by natural evolution. And with the enhancement modifications she had made to herself combined with the neural link she shared with her dragons, she could see the ship not as an insurmountable obstacle but as a machine. A complex machine, certainly, A machine with many redundant systems and clever design choices, but ultimately still just a machine. Machines could be broken. Behind her and slightly to her right, Zephon kept pace effortlessly. The two dragons had grown significantly in the 3 months since their hatching. They were now nearly 30 meters from nose to tail, with a wingspan that exceeded 50 meters. Their scales had hardened from the soft, vulnerable tissue of newborns to something that was harder than steel, but still retained the flexibility and beauty of living flesh. Their claws could cut through metal. Their bite force could snap the hull of a small shuttlecraft. And they were intelligent enough to understand strategy and tactics. Through their neural link, Maya shared her plan with the dragons. They would approach the warship from above and behind, where the sensor arrays had weaker coverage. They would test the defensive systems without committing to a full attack. They needed to gather data about how the Vorthan would respond to an aerial threat that was biological rather than technological. Once they understood the response patterns, they could figure out weaknesses that could be exploited in future battles. Kira understood immediately. The dragon adjusted her flight path, angling higher to make use of the thin atmosphere as cover. Zephon followed, the two dragons moving in perfect synchronization. Maya could feel both of their consciousnesses through the neural link, could sense their excitement and their focus. They had been born for this. Every scale on their bodies, every muscle fiber, every neural pathway had been designed with the goal of fighting enemies like the Vorthan in her mind. The warship's sensors detected them when they were still 8 kilometers away. Maya felt the moment the Vorthan became aware of the dragons through the increased energy signature from the ship's weapons systems. The defensive turrets began to track their movement, and seconds later, the first energy bolt streaked toward them through the sky. Kira banked left with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature of her size. The energy bolt passed harmlessly beneath her wings. Zephon rolled right at the exact same moment that the second bolt was fired. The coordinated movements were so perfect that they could only have been executed by creatures who shared a single consciousness. This was the advantage that bonded dragons gave over conventional weapons. Where human pilots would need time to communicate and coordinate their movements, the dragons acted as a single entity with multiple bodies. More bolts came. The resistance was thinking faster now, trying to compensate for the unusual tactics. But the dragons were faster still. Maya guided them through the incoming fire, with a precision that would have been impossible without the enhancements she had made to her own nervous system. Her reaction time had been increased by nearly 400%, compared to an unmodified elf. Combined with her ability to share consciousness with the dragons, she could make minute adjustments to their flight path thousands of times per second. But the dragons did not just evade. They attacked. Kira dove toward the nearest weapons turret while Zephon provided cover fire. By cover fire, Maya meant that Zephon began breathing a stream of superheated plasma that forced the Vorthan gunners to focus their fire on the other dragon rather than continuing to attack Kira. When Kira reached the weapons turret, she simply tore it apart with her claws. The turret had been designed to destroy other machines and spacecraft. It had never been designed to withstand the physical attacks of a creature that was intelligent, powerful, and close enough to touch. The warship began to maneuver. It was a slow, ponderous movement, nothing like the quick, evasive maneuvers of a living creature, but it was moving nonetheless. The vessel was trying to orient itself, so that it could bring more weapons to bear on the dragons. Maya realized that she had maybe 30 seconds before the Vorthan would have enough firepower concentrated on this area to overwhelm even her and her dragons. She sent the signal to retreat, and Kira and Zephon immediately altered their flight path. They had come here to gather data, not to die in a suicide attack. Getting killed in a frontal assault would accomplish nothing. What mattered was surviving to apply what they had learned. As they fled back toward the atmosphere in the canyon, a Vorthan interceptor squadron launched from a bay in the warship's hull. These were fast, deadly machines piloted by Vorthan officers who had experience with aerial combat. They began to close the distance between themselves and the dragons with terrifying speed. Within seconds, they would be in weapons range. But that was when the second part of Maya's plan activated. Hidden in orbit above the planet, a satellite that she and the resistance engineers had spent weeks modifying began to broadcast a powerful electromagnetic pulse. It was not powerful enough to damage the Vorthan warship from this distance, but it was powerful enough to interfere with the targeting systems of the interceptors and temporarily jam their communications. The lead interceptor suddenly began to veer upward, its guidance system confused by the electromagnetic noise. The second interceptor collided with it, both machines tumbling out of control. The remaining interceptors managed to maintain their formation, but their targeting systems were degraded. By the time they had recovered from the electromagnetic pulse, Kira and Zephon were already descending into the upper atmosphere, where the air was thick enough to provide some protection from distant weapons fire. They landed in the canyon 20 minutes later. The resistance fighters who had been monitoring their progress through a combination of radar and the neural communications relay that Maya had established erupted into cheers and shouts. They had done it. They had attacked a Vorthan warship and escaped. It was a small victory in the larger war. The warship had sustained only minor damage. It would be operational and ready to resume bombardment within hours, but it was proof that the Vorthan could be hurt. It was proof that the dragons could fight at altitudes and speeds that conventional forces could not match. That night, Maya reviewed all the data they had gathered. The targeting systems on the Vorthan warship followed predictable patterns. The weapons tracked in specific quadrants before needing to reorient. The defensive turrets had blind spots where they could not aim their fire. The interceptors were fast, but not as fast as dragons. The Vorthan seemed to rely heavily on their technological advantage, and seemed less experienced in dealing with biological threats. They had clearly not prepared for the possibility of encountering intelligent beings who could fly and fight like predators, rather than like conventional soldiers. She shared this analysis with the Council and suggested a new strategy. Instead of trying to destroy the Vorthan ships, they should focus on making them unable to operate effectively. They should attack the landing shuttles and supply convoys. They should strike the power generation stations that the Vorthan had established on the planet's surface. They should make it so expensive and so difficult to maintain the occupation that the Vorthan would eventually decide that Ethermore was not worth the cost. The Council debated this proposal for hours. Some of the more militant members wanted to focus on finding a way to destroy the warships themselves, but Theron and the other experienced warriors understood what Maya was suggesting. This was the strategy of humans who had learned through thousands of years of warfare how to resist occupation. You did not need to defeat your enemy completely. You just needed to make them hurt enough and long enough that they eventually gave up. The next day, the raids began. Small groups of fighters led by Maya and her dragons began to strike at specific targets across the continent. A Vorthan mining operation would be attacked and destroyed. A power plant would be sabotaged. A supply convoy would be ambushed. Each strike was calculated to cause maximum damage while minimizing risk to the raiders. Each strike was carefully planned based on intelligence that the resistance had gathered. And for the first time since the invasion began, the Vorthan started losing. Not militarily, at least not in the conventional sense, but they were losing resources and time, and most importantly, they were losing the sense of inevitable superiority that had made them so confident when they arrived. 6 months into the resistance campaign, Maya captured her first Vorthan commander. The creature was commanding an installation on the eastern continent when a coordinated raid managed to breach the defensive perimeter. The commander had attempted to escape in a personal shuttle, but Zephon had intercepted the craft before it could reach orbit. The shuttle crashed in a mountain valley, and when the resistance fighters arrived, they found the commander alive but injured. The commander was a tall creature with a segmented exoskeleton and multiple limbs that seemed designed for both tool manipulation and combat. Its intelligence was obvious from the moment it opened its compound eyes and assessed its surroundings. It did not panic or attempt to attack despite being outnumbered and outgunned. It simply looked at Maya with what might have been respect or might have been resignation. It was difficult to read emotions on an alien face. Maya chose to take the commander alive instead of executing it. This decision caused some debate among the resistance fighters. Many of them wanted to kill the Vorthan where it stood. The creature had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of their people through its commands and strategic decisions. But Maya insisted on bringing the commander back to the canyon for interrogation. In the detention chamber deep beneath the settlement, Maya spent days speaking with the Vorthan commander. She had learned enough of its language to conduct basic conversations. Through the neural implant in her head, she could access translation software that made understanding the alien speech much easier. The commander's name was something that human vocal cords could not properly pronounce. Maya called it simply Commander 7. The creature did not object to this naming. In fact, Commander 7 seemed almost relieved to have someone to talk to. The isolation of its capture combined with its genuine curiosity about the biology and technology of the beings that had defeated it created a strange kind of camaraderie between them. Commander 7 explained that the Vorthan Collective was not a military force in the way that Maya understood such things. It was a resource acquisition civilization. They identified worlds with valuable resources or strategic positions and moved to occupy them. The occupation itself was not usually difficult because most biological species lacked both the weapons technology and the organizational capacity to mount serious resistance. The Vorthan assumed that any resistance would collapse quickly once they demonstrated their superior power. Ethermore was supposed to be easy. The Vorthan databases indicated that the elves were a peaceful species focused on philosophy and art, rather than warfare. They had been classified as a low-threat civilization. Nobody had expected the sudden emergence of hybrid warriors bonded to dragons that could not be easily countered with conventional tactics. Maya asked Commander 7 why the Vorthan did not simply destroy the entire resistance instead of trying to capture it. She asked why they did not simply bombard the planet from orbit with weapons of such power that nothing biological could possibly survive. Commander 7 explained something that changed the way Maya understood the war. It said that the Vorthan Collective was not invincible. It was powerful and disciplined and technologically advanced, but it was also in constant competition with other collective forces for resources and territory. If the Ethermore occupation became too costly, if it started consuming resources that could be better used elsewhere, then the leadership would pull out and move to easier targets. The commander said that Maya was making Ethermore expensive to occupy. Every destroyed installation, every dead Vorthan warrior, every damaged ship represented a drain on resources. The mathematics of resource management meant that eventually, the collective would decide that Ethermore was not worth the cost. This revelation gave Maya an idea. She began to ask Commander 7 detailed questions about Vorthan logistics, about their supply lines and communication networks, about which installations were most vital to the occupation effort. The commander refused to answer at first, maintaining its loyalty to the collective despite being captured. But Maya was patient. She had learned from human negotiation tactics that you could sometimes accomplish more through conversation than through force. She shared her own story with the commander. She told it about her father and the destruction of her people. She told it about the genetic modifications and the dragon bonding, and the desperate hope that drove her and her people to keep fighting. She told it that she understood the Vorthan were simply doing what their nature compelled them to do, but that she could not allow her people to be extinguished. Something about this narrative seemed to affect Commander 7 in a way that Maya did not fully understand. The creature spent an entire night in silence after hearing her story. When it finally spoke again, it was in a quieter voice and its movements seemed less rigid than before. Commander 7 agreed to answer her questions. It provided intelligence about Vorthan operations, supply routes, and defensive capabilities. It told her which installations would be most damaging to eliminate. It told her where the Vorthan command center was located and what security systems protected it. It essentially provided the resistance with a complete map of Vorthan vulnerabilities. When the other resistance leaders asked Maya why Commander 7 was helping them, she did not have a good answer. The creature was still a Vorthan. It still served the collective. Yet it had chosen to betray its own military for reasons that seemed to transcend simple logic or strategic calculation. When Maya asked the commander directly, it gave an answer that she would remember for the rest of her life. Commander 7 said that it had spent 1,000 cycles serving the collective, occupying world after world, witnessing the extinction of species after species. It had never questioned the necessity of this work until it met someone like Maya, someone who refused to accept defeat, someone who was willing to sacrifice everything for something she believed in, someone who was willing to see the enemy not as a machine to be destroyed, but as a being to be reasoned with. The commander said that in all of its 1,000 cycles, it had never encountered another species that was willing to save the life of an enemy combatant instead of executing it. This simple act of mercy had shaken the commander's understanding of what was possible. It had made the commander question whether the collective's way of doing things was truly the only way, or whether there might be other paths that did not necessarily require the extinction of all life that was not Vorthan. Maya released Commander 7 after 2 weeks of interrogation. She gave the creature supplies and a map to the coordinates of a settlement where other surviving elves were hiding. She told it that it could choose to return to the Vorthan collective and report her position, in which case both of them would likely die. Or it could walk away and leave Ethermore and never return. The choice, Maya said, was his own to make. Commander 7 walked away that night. Maya never learned what happened to the creature after that. The Vorthan never attacked the settlement that Maya had directed it to, which suggested that perhaps the commander had indeed chosen to leave Ethermore and begin a new life somewhere away from the conflict. But the intelligence that Commander 7 had provided proved invaluable. Using that information, the Resistance executed a series of surgical strikes that destroyed the Vorthan Command Center and several of their most important logistics hubs. The occupation force suddenly found itself without clear direction and facing severe supply shortages. The discipline that had made the Vorthan such an effective military force began to crack. More Vorthan soldiers began to accept offers of surrender rather than fighting to the death. Some of them, like Commander 7 before them, began to question whether the occupation was worth the cost. The Vorthan command in orbit sent desperate messages to their superiors in the broader collective, warning that the occupation of Ethermore was becoming untenable and requesting either significant reinforcements or permission to evacuate. The permission to evacuate came 2 weeks later. The Vorthan had apparently decided that Ethermore was not a valuable enough prize to justify the increasing cost. The occupation force began to withdraw, pulling back to their landing zones and preparing their ships for departure. Maya watched from the sky on the back of Kira as the Vorthan warships began to lift off from the planet's surface. Behind her, thousands of resistance fighters cheered and celebrated the end of the invasion. The war was over. They had won. Against all odds and all logic, the remnants of elf civilization had survived and had driven back the invaders who threatened their complete extinction. But as Maya looked up at the departing ships, she did not feel pure joy. She felt something more complicated. She had learned through this conflict that even the most alien beings, even the ones who seemed to embody pure malice and indifference to suffering, could be reached through empathy and reason. She had learned that survival was not just about having the biggest weapons or the most powerful military. Survival was about understanding your enemy and finding ways to make peace or at least mutual coexistence preferable to continued conflict. 1 year after the Vorthan evacuation, Ethermore was in the midst of a profound transformation. The ruins of the cities were being rebuilt, not in the same styles as before, but with a new architecture that blended elf tradition with the functional principles of human design. The settlements were stronger now, more resilient, better prepared to withstand future threats. The survivors were learning to adapt and change in ways that would have been unthinkable before the invasion. Maya stood in the new council chamber and listened as the elders debated the future of their civilization. There were still voices among them that wanted to purge the genetic modifications and return to the pure elf form that had dominated their world for millennia. But these voices were growing quieter. Most of the council understood that the path of rigid tradition had nearly led to their extinction. The path of adaptation and change had saved them. The council voted to formally accept the hybrid warriors into their society. They voted to establish a new branch of government that would oversee the continued development and training of dragon riders. They voted to declassify the human technological knowledge and make it available to all their scientists and engineers. It was not a perfect acceptance. There were still factions that grumbled about contamination and heresy. But it was acceptance nonetheless. Kira and Zephon had grown even larger over the year of peace. They were now the size of small buildings, powerful enough to carry multiple riders if needed. They had become symbols of the new elf civilization, proof that strength could come from embracing change and taking risks. Young elves began to volunteer for the Dragon Rider program, hoping to bond with the new dragons that the resistance engineers were creating, using the genetic templates and the knowledge that had been preserved. Maya was offered a place on the council. The elders wanted her to help guide the future development of their people. They wanted her voice and her wisdom to shape the policies that would determine whether their civilization could truly heal and grow. She accepted the position, understanding that the burden of leadership would be even heavier than the burden of survival had been. But she did not abandon the dragons or the caves where she had spent so much time over the past year. She divided her time between the council chambers and the training grounds where the new generation of dragon riders were learning to bond with their creatures and master the art of aerial combat. She understood that the knowledge and skills she had developed could not be allowed to fade away. They would need to be passed on and preserved and continuously improved upon. One evening, as the sun was setting over the canyon, a ship descended from the sky. It was not a Vorthan vessel. It was a small diplomatic craft with markings that identified it as belonging to the human coalition, the governing body of what had once been the scattered human colony worlds scattered across this region of the galaxy. The ship landed in a designated neutral zone, and a single figure emerged. The human was a woman named Sophia. She was tall and lean, with the kind of bearing that suggested she had spent her life in military service. She carried herself with confidence and respect. Through the diplomatic channels that had been established, Sophia explained that the coalition had heard about what had happened on Ethermore. They had heard about the elf civilization that had bonded with dragons and driven back a Vorthan invasion. They wanted to establish formal diplomatic relations and possibly military cooperation. Maya met with Sophia in a neutral chamber. The two women looked at each other across a table laden with food and water and the formal trappings of diplomatic negotiation. They were from different species, from different planets, from different cultures and traditions, but they recognized something in each other immediately. They both understood what it meant to fight against impossible odds. They both understood what it meant to be willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure the survival of your people. Sophia told Maya that the coalition would like to establish a formal alliance with the elves of Ethermore. She explained that the Vorthan collective was a threat to all biological life in the region. The humans had been resisting Vorthan expansion for decades. An alliance with a civilization that had successfully defeated a Vorthan occupation force would strengthen the position of all of them. Maya accepted on behalf of the council, though she made clear that the elves would not simply become soldiers in a human war. They would cooperate and share intelligence and military resources. But Ethermore would remain independent and free to make its own decisions about when and how to engage in conflict. Sophia agreed to these terms. She told Maya that she had come here expecting to find a desperate civilization struggling to recover from invasion. Instead, she had found a people who were already rebuilding and reimagining their future. She said that Ethermore and its dragon riders would be an invaluable ally in the struggles that were coming. After Sophia left, Maya climbed to the highest point in the canyon and sat between Kira and Zephon. She felt the familiar presence of the dragons through the neural link, felt their contentment at her touch and the soft vibration of their breathing. She looked up at the stars and thought about her father and about the journey that had led her from a librarian in the archives to a war leader bonded with dragons, and a voice in the governance of her people. She thought about Commander 7 and wondered what path that creature had chosen after leaving Ethermore. She thought about the Vorthan soldiers who had been evacuated, and whether any of them had learned anything from their time fighting against beings who refused to be conquered. She thought about the future and what challenges might still be waiting for her people. The elder Theron found her there as the night was deepening. He climbed slowly but steadily up the canyon wall and sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together, an old warrior and a young one, watching the stars turn in their eternal cycle above the world they had fought to preserve. Finally, Theron said something that Maya would think about often in the years that followed. He said that survival was not a victory. Survival was just the beginning. Real victory would come when the elves of Ethermore had not just rebuilt their civilization but had fundamentally transformed it into something new and powerful and capable of standing on equal footing with any other force in the galaxy. Real victory would come when they stopped thinking of themselves as victims of the Vorthan invasion and started thinking of themselves as a people who had been reforged by adversity into something greater than they had been before. Maya nodded at his words. She understood what he was saying. She understood that the hard work of rebuilding was just beginning. The battles with the Vorthan had been easy in comparison to the work of transforming a culture that had valued peace and stasis into one that could embrace change and still maintain its connection to its heritage and traditions. But as she looked at her dragons and felt their presence in her mind and thought about the young elves, who were even now learning to bond with new dragons that were being created in the laboratories, Maya believed that it was possible. She believed that her people could transform and adapt and survive. She believed that they could build a civilization that honored both their elf heritage and the human determination that had been woven into their being through genetic modification and cultural adaptation. The Vorthen had come to Ethermore, expecting easy prey and a simple occupation. They had found instead a people willing to do anything to survive. They had found beings who could blend ancient wisdom with cutting-edge technology. They had found dragons and dragon riders who could fight in ways that the Vorthon military had never encountered before. They had found that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was not the one with the biggest weapons, but the one who had the will to keep fighting even when everything seemed impossible. As the dawn began to break over Ethermore, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Maya felt something like peace settle over her. The war was over. The invasion had been repelled. Her people had survived, and now came the real challenge. Now came the work of rebuilding and transforming and creating something new that could endure. Now came the responsibility of making sure that the sacrifice of those who had died during the invasion meant something. Now came the work of building a future worthy of the price that had been paid. Kira made a low sound that expressed her contentment. Zephon nuzzled against Maya's shoulder, and together, the woman and her dragons watched as the new day began to spread across their world, bringing light and hope and the promise of possibility to all those who had lived to see it arrive.